At the beginning, I did think I was going to die, and so from that moment on, one has to have certain goals that you have to set. The first goal, of course, was to live.
On December 20th, 1968, the bodies of two teenagers were discovered down a secluded lover's lane in Vallejo, California. This would mark the beginning of a rampage across Northern California that would leave 5 dead and 2 barely escaping death. 56 years later, and no one has been officially charged with arguably one of the biggest mysteries in American crime. Even though there is loads of evidence, including letters sent by the killer to the police taunting them, multiple witness accounts, and a suspect that fits the police profile perfectly. This is the mystery of the Zodiac. Hi, my name is Tasha, and this is my series White Rabbit, where we deep dive into anything spooky, odd, or just interesting while I apply some special effects makeup. Today, we're technically covering several cases because today we are covering our first serial killer. So I don't want to do a super long intro. I just want to get to the story because there's a lot of information.
Get on with it.
Today's makeup is Ghost Pirate. Okay, I know you're wondering how I got Ghost Pirate when this is a story about the Zodiac Killer, but I'm gonna step you through it, okay? It was definitely a reach. Just walk by faith and not by sight with me for a second. I'm gonna connect the dots. When I was brainstorming about what makeup I wanted to do with this story, I asked myself, what do I think of when I think of California? And I've actually never been to California. So me personally, I think of the ocean. And when I thought about the ocean, I thought about this rabbit hole that I fell down with pirate makeup, Flying Dutchman. What's the other one? Davy Jones, drowned makeup.
What's the damn word again?
So anyway, I thought to myself, I would like to do that. And now I have the opportunity to do it by very distant dots. But yeah, that's the makeup we're doing today. Also, there are some pretty important characters and their last name is Seawater. And I thought, confirmation. If you like this type of content, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and let the algorithm know that you like me back. Okay, we're gonna jump right in with the first known crime. On December 20th, 1968, 16-year-old Betty Lou Jensen and 17-year-old David Faraday went to a secluded lover's lane on Lake Herman Road. Lake Herman Road was a very secluded road. Some of the local teenagers would go there and race cars and drink alcohol, but there was no real reason to be on that road other than not wanting to be seen. Betty Lou and David were local high school students that were actually on their first date. They had a really good date night and they were ending their night on Lake Herman Road. They wanted to get some alone time and I'm sure a few smooches before they had to go back to their parents. At approximately 11:15 p.m., a strange man approached their car and essentially just rained bullets on these two teenagers. David was said to have been killed instantly. His body was found directly next to his car. Betty Lou had tried to run and she was shot 5 times in the back. Her body was found about 28 yards away from the car. The very first theory that police had was that this was a robbery gone terribly wrong. But they quickly disproved that theory because nothing was taken. Police ran every forensic test that they had available, but there was essentially no evidence at the scene. They spoke to friends and family members, but no one had any idea who would do this to them. The police were coming up completely empty-handed, and the case soon went cold. 7 months later, on July 4th, 1969, 22-year-old Darlene Farron was out celebrating the holiday with her 16-year-old little sister. They went to a lighted boat parade, they saw fireworks, and afterwards, the two went to a local coffee shop called Terry's Waffles. Darlene actually worked there, so she stopped in just for a chit chat and probably a nice little employee discount on her waffles. After they left Terry's Waffles, Darlene went back to her parents' house to drop off her little sister because it was getting kind of late. But she begged her dad to let her take her sister out for a little longer, watch a little more fireworks. Dad was like, hell no, absolutely not. She's only 16. She's been out all night. The night's a wrap for her. Once it was obvious that he was not going to change his mind, Darlene said goodbye to her father and she headed out. Just a few hours later, Darlene's little sister was awakened to the sound of her father sobbing, telling her that her sister was dead. Darlene and her 19-year-old friend Michael Maju had parked at a golf course and they were just sitting there talking. There were probably still fireworks going on because it's the 4th of July. They were sitting there when they saw these headlights shining through their window. A man got out of his car and walked toward them, shining a flashlight directly into their eyes. They're thinking it's the police, so they're trying to hurry up and get their IDs out. But then the man just starts to open fire on them. Michael flipped into the back seat and tried to crawl out of the car, but the man just kept firing at them. He even walked away, heard Michael cry out in pain a little bit, turned around, came back, and started shooting more. Darlene was shot 9 times and Michael was shot 4 times. 45 minutes later, the police receive a call from a man telling them that he just shot 2 people. And this same man was also claiming responsibility for the Lake Herman Road shooting. The police hadn't pieced together anything about that crime, so he just gave that to him for free. What the shooter didn't know was that Michael had actually survived. And when he came back to shoot at Michael more, he had gotten a good look at his face. Well, I don't know if I would classify it as a good look, but he got a look. The description was kind of vague, but it's all they had. The man was white, between 5'8" and 5'9". He was in his late 20s to early 30s with a stocky build, a round face, and brown hair. First, the police looked into Darlene's husband. They thought that maybe there was a little more going on with Darlene and the disrespect of his tail. First, the police looked into Darlene's husband. They thought maybe there was more going on with Darlene and Michael's relationship, and the husband found out and just became enraged. Everyone shut that down pretty early. Michael and Darlene were just friends, and besides that, her husband had an alibi. He was a cook, and that's a pretty solid alibi. They would know if the cook was gone. Once Darlene's husband was cleared, the police had another cold case on their hands. On July 31st, 1969, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Vallejo Times-Herald, and the San Francisco Examiner all received letters signed with the symbol that we now know represents the Zodiac. Each letter contained a cipher or a puzzle, and the Zodiac claimed that if they could solve these 3 ciphers, it would reveal to police who he was. The ciphers were a series of letters, symbols, and half-shaded shapes that at first glance mean absolutely nothing. The Zodiac demanded that these ciphers be printed on the front page or he would go on a killing rampage. He said that he would drive around all weekend picking off lone people or secluded couples. In these letters, the Zodiac takes responsibility for all of the attacks that have been happening and even reveals information that only the killer would know. He talked about what Darlene was wearing, some of the injuries that some of the victims had. He even verified what type of ammo was used. That was something that was never in the press. They did not release that information. That was information only the police and the shooter knew. The newspapers had a deadline of when they needed to print the cipher. I think they had a couple of days. So of course they went to the police, and the police had a dedicated, not the police, the FBI had a dedicated group of cryptologists trying to crack this cipher before the deadline. They ended up running out of time, so the ciphers were printed on the front page of the top 3 newspapers. So now everyone knows there's a freaking lunatic on the loose. The benefit of thousands of private citizens now knowing that this lunatic is on the loose is that thousands of private citizens are now trying to crack this cipher. Everyone wanted to solve it. And about a week after the cipher was published, 2 school teachers would be the ones to crack the code. Don and Betty Hardin had sat down together to work on this cipher. It was their theory that somewhere in this cipher would be the word kill, so they would need a double L. Basically what they did is they went through and looked for double symbols that could represent double L's, and their theory was right. This led them to cracking the code. In this letter, the Zodiac reveals that he actually loves what he's doing right now. He's enjoying it so much, and he even referred to people as game that he was hunting. Even though he said it would be, his name was not revealed. According to the Zodiac, he was collecting souls for the afterlife, and if he revealed his name, it would only allow police to slow him down. He basically just lied to make sure that everyone was working on this cipher, and then he didn't follow through with his promise. Police did a shady little move and acted like they didn't really believe that this was actually the person, and they publicly cast doubt that the letter was valid. And they told him, prove it. If it's real, prove it. The Zodiac replied with a second letter, and in this letter, he gave a clue to the police. Not about who he was, but it was more of like a glimpse into his crimes, how he operated. In this letter, the Zodiac says, "Last Christmas, police were wondering how I was able to shoot and hit my victims in the dark. What I did was tape a small pencil flashlight to the barrel of my gun. All I had to do was spray them as if it were a water hose." September 27th, 1969, just over 2 months later, Brian Hartnell, 20, and Cecilia Shepard, 22, were relaxing by Lake Berryessa when a man suddenly appeared. He approached them wearing this squared hood, and the front of the outfit, I don't know if it was part of the shirt or like the hood, but it had the Zodiac symbol on it. The hood he wore over his head had 2 little slits for the eyes, and there were glasses clipped to the outside of the hood. It was described as looking like a medieval style executioner's hood, and he also had military style combat boots. The man, who was carrying a knife and a gun, approached them with his gun drawn, and then he tied them up with these pre-cut nylon strips before telling them that he had to kill them. Once they were unable to fight back, the man then stabbed them multiple times. This next part is a little graphic, but one of the officers on scene described them as being chopped up, and he said that he'd never seen anything so gruesome, even when he was called to the scene of boating accidents. That's a lot. After brutally attacking Brian and Cecilia, the man then walked to Brian's car and wrote the date and "by knife" next to it, and then he also wrote the dates of other Zodiac crimes. Cecilia would unfortunately succumb to her injuries, but amazingly and miraculously, Brian survived. October 11th, 1969, just like 2 weeks later, 29-year-old Paul Stein, a taxi driver, picked up someone standing in front of the local movie theater. This guy hops in and tells Paul where to take him. He says he wants to go on the corner of Washington and Cherry Street. So, like normal, Paul starts to drive. But unfortunately for Paul, this was no normal cab ride because his passenger took out a gun and shot Paul in the back of the head. 2 witnesses told police that the shooter appeared to be wiping the cab down with some type of cloth. This cloth was actually found to be a piece of Paul's shirt that the shooter had ripped off of him, then saturated with his blood before taking it with him. The man took off on foot. I can't even say took off because he walked away from that crime scene so calmly that when he encountered police on their way to the crime scene, they stopped him, but only to ask him if he had seen anything. The shooter pointed them in the opposite direction of where everything happened, and they took off in pursuit of who was actually right in front of them.
Ugh. Idiot.
The police did get a sketch of a possible suspect by working with witnesses who saw him near the crime scene. This was the first time that the Zodiac had ever struck in such a high populated area. Normally his crimes were in very remote areas. So initially the crime wasn't even linked to the Zodiac Killer. They thought it was just some random robbery that had gone wrong. That was until the Zodiac sent a package to the San Francisco Chronicle with a letter and that piece of blood-soaked shirt from the crime scene. In this package was another letter from the Zodiac. And in this letter, he was threatening to wipe out entire school buses full of children. Like, he was saying things like he was going to shoot out the tires, and then as the children were trying to run out, he was just going to like pick them off one by one. Sick, twisted things. People were already in a panic, but this letter really sent everyone into a panic. The police even began escorting school buses as they dropped children off. One thing about the Zodiac was that he was full of surprises. He attacked lone victims, he attacked couples. He had killed in isolated areas, he had killed in very public areas. Men, women, he didn't seem to have a type, so they didn't put it past him that he would attack children. And also they had no lead, so they were basically just hoping to deter the attack by being present. There was no attack on children or school buses, but about 2 weeks after Paul Stine's murder, the San Francisco Chronicle received another letter from the Zodiac. It was actually another cipher, and this one was a lot shorter and a lot harder to crack. It was almost like infinite possibilities. The Zodiac seemed to take a lot of pleasure in the fact that the police could not crack this cipher. Two very famous detectives, Dave Toschi and Bill Armstrong, were both on this case, and still, like 14 months in, they had no leads. I don't know if anyone has seen the movie Dirty Harry with Clint Eastwood. I have not, but supposedly this character was based off of Dave. He was like a legend, but even the legend himself had like zero idea when it came to suspects. And it's not as if they weren't discovering clues all the time. I mean, he was writing them back and forth. It's just that these clues never led to anyone specific. It's interesting, it's a clue, but that doesn't lead to a person. Like in the Paul Stine case. So Paul Stine picked up the Zodiac outside of a movie theater. The movie that was playing at the theater was called The Mikado. And in The Mikado, there was a character called the Executioner, who the Zodiac, for lack of better word, was inspired by, clearly. And in Zodiac letters, he has referenced the Mikado before. But that was pretty much a useless clue because it didn't lead directly to anybody. All it showed was that the Zodiac was really thinking through his crimes, and he also had this kind of like God complex. But these were things that were already known to police. They already knew the Zodiac was an attention whore.
You're a whore. Wear your whore makeup, you whore.
This is why he kept writing letters to the police and taunting them and trying to get the public terrified, threatening to attack children. There was even one letter where the Zodiac demanded that the public start wearing buttons with his symbol on it. And when nobody did that, he wrote another letter to the police, and there was like a map included with this letter. And basically they had to follow the map to be led to this bomb. There was a little cipher included with the map, but no one could ever figure out the cipher, so they were never led to this bomb that actually never exploded. In a later letter, the Zodiac claimed that he did put a bomb somewhere, but apparently it was a dud and it just didn't go off. So I guess he meant what he said about the buttons. The vibe of San Francisco at the time was pure terror. Everywhere you turned, there was the Zodiac. They were writing about him in every single paper, which of course they were because he kept contacting them. This was a huge story, especially for the San Francisco Chronicle. That was the newspaper that actually received that torn piece of bloody shirt from the Paul Stine crime scene. Paul Avery was a reporter for the Chronicle at the time, and he was basically obsessed with this case. Paul started to branch out from the known Zodiac attacks, and what he found was another very similar attack in 1966. So this was a few years before the Zodiac killings had started, as far as everyone knew. I'm not super familiar with the cities in California and their proximities, but I used Google Maps to help, and all of the other attacks seemed to be relatively close, like within a few hours of each other, but this one was about 7 hours away. So that's part of the reason why they didn't connect it to the Zodiac. They didn't think that was like his area of operation. October 31st, 1966, a man named Joseph Bates called police to report his daughter missing. Sherry Jo Bates had left a note to her father saying that she was going to be at the campus library, but she never returned home. That same day, police were called to Riverside College campus because someone had reported a body. The body was confirmed to be 18-year-old Sherry Jo Bates. She had been stabbed and slashed to death and left to bleed out. About a month after Sherry Jo was killed, the police received a confession letter with some very, very dark details. The two of them were walking from the library. He saw her leaving and followed her out. And after a few minutes, he told her, "It's time for you to die." And he just started stabbing her. The writer said that he did cover her mouth, but she was able to get out like one quick scream. And he responded to that by kicking her in her head, then cutting her throat so that she couldn't scream again. This person not only went into detail about the crime, but he also went into detail about his sick fantasies and how he enjoyed doing this. He said that Sherry was not his first victim and she would not be the last. At the end, the writer requested that this letter be published for everyone to read. Sounds familiar, right? 6 months after Sherry's death, 3 letters were received. One by the police, one by the local newspaper, and one by her father, Joseph Bates. The letter simply said, "Bates had to die, there will be more," and it was signed with an interesting Z. Paul Avery had these letters analyzed, and it was said to be a match to the letters sent by the Zodiac. Still, for some reason, this case isn't widely accepted to have been a part of the Zodiac cases. Like even today, people are still divided on if it was or if it wasn't. In 1971, there was a break in the case, or at least a lead that police could follow, when a man named Don Chaney came into the San Francisco Police Department, and he said that he had something he just needed to get off of his chest. Don wanted to tell the police about his friend Arthur Lee Allen, who he had been estranged from for about 2 years. According to Don, Arthur was attending this yearly race car course, and he had stopped by his apartment that Don actually shared with Arthur's brother just for a little chit chat after the course. Basically, they all get to talking, and Arthur starts saying some really weird things, including talking about shooting out the tire of a school bus and then picking off the little kids as they came running out. Don remembered this from the Zodiac letters, and it made him really uncomfortable that his roommate's brother was quoting a very active serial killer. Arthur also talked about how hunting humans would actually be the greatest skill. Very weird conversation going on. Don thought it was weird too, and he basically made it a point from then on out to never be around Arthur again. He said it was clear that Arthur was showing signs of a disturbed spirit. So, who is Arthur Lee Allen? Arthur Lee Allen was born December 18th, 1933 in Honolulu, Hawaii. He was the son of Ethan Allen, a Navy commander, and Bernice Allen, a homemaker. Growing up in a military family, Arthur experienced a very structured childhood, very disciplined. And like a lot of military families, they moved around a lot. So there was a bit of instability just as far as Arthur not knowing when he was going to be ripped from whatever life he had gotten used to and introduced into a new one. The Allens eventually settled in Vallejo, California, where Arthur spent most of his youth and his young adulthood. Arthur was said to have a very strained relationship with his father. His father was very strict and very demanding, and Arthur did not like that at all. Arthur had an older brother named Ronald, and I don't know exactly what he did, but apparently he was successful. And the vibe I got was that he was favored, at least by his father, and was thought to be more successful by his father. In his father's eyes, Ronald was this golden child, and Arthur was just struggling. This created not only tension in the relationship with Arthur and Ronald, but it also just created this sense of inadequacy inside of Arthur. Arthur just lived in the shadow of his brother, so obviously not fun. As a teenager, Arthur developed a reputation for being very intelligent, but also being a loner. He was always reading or spending time in nature. He graduated from Vallejo High School and he later attended Vallejo College, where he received an Associates of Arts degree, but he ended up going to the Navy just like his father. After being discharged from the Navy, he became an elementary school teacher at Santa Rosa Elementary in Atascadero, California in 1961. Atascadero. Mr. Allen, as his students called him, was described as a very large but very friendly and gentle man. It was almost as if he went the extra mile to be gentle so that he wouldn't intimidate these tiny humans that he was towering over. This is how Arthur Allen met the Seawaters. Don Seawater was in the 1st grade, Connie Seawater was in the 3rd grade, and David Seawater was in Mr. Allen's 4th grade class. There were 6 or 7 children total, but we're just going to focus on 3 because they had most of the interactions with Arthur Allen. A few months into the school year in 1961, Connie started receiving tutoring from Mr. Allen. Well, sometimes the tutoring would go kind of late, and even though her brother would be with her, Mr. Allen started to drive them home because he just didn't want them walking home by themselves so late. This was how he struck up a relationship with Phyllis, and this was how he found out that their father was no longer in the home. He was actually being institutionalized at a state hospital. So Phyllis, who was pregnant with her 7th child, really had her hands full. It wasn't only the fact that Paul was being institutionalized that made the family so vulnerable at this moment, but also the reason why. Little Connie had reported her father for inappropriate touching. I don't know what I can say on YouTube, but you know what that means. He was sick and twisted, and his daughter testified against him in court. He told Connie that he was teaching her how to be a good wife, and the courts locked his ass up and labeled him a sexual psychopath.
Period.
When Arthur heard this, he tried to step in and help Phyllis out. He would come over for dinner all the time and he would bring dessert. He would bring the kids toys and treats. He would even help Phyllis prepare the food and then stay after to help clean up. And I know she appreciated that because 6 kids and pregnant by yourself is a lot. So even if he was just washing dishes, he was the supportive friend in her time of need. And him being there for her and the children during this time would solidify a bond between them that would literally never be broken. The first time Arthur Lee Allen's name popped up on police radar wasn't in 1971. It was actually in 1969 during the Lake Berryessa shooting. The area around the lake was very secluded. There was only 10 people along the entire stretch of the lake. And one of those 10 people just so happened to get pulled over for speeding. When the officer approached the vehicle, he saw 2 bloody knives sitting on the passenger seat. So obviously the officer asked the driver, "What's that about?" The driver assured the officer that this was only animal blood and that he had just killed a chicken. The only reason he was even in this area was because he was doing some diving. Apparently that was a good enough explanation for the officer because he did let the driver go.
Say what?
He did, however, issue a speeding ticket to a Mr. Arthur Lee Allen. Other than being at the location of one of the crimes, Arthur Lee Allen had something else in common with the Zodiac. Mr. Allen would share this not only with the Seawater children, but also his entire 4th grade class. He taught his entire 4th grade class not only how to decode ciphers, but also how to create their own in a way that was eerily similar to the Zodiac. Mr. Allen would give them 1 cipher to decode for the entire week, and while they worked on it, he would play the Mikado. Do you remember what was playing at the theater that Paul Stein picked up the Zodiac from? It was the Mikado. I'm sure you know now. I actually tried to watch this. It's on YouTube. I only made it 8 minutes in at like double speed, but it's an opera and I don't like operas. I don't even like musicals, so maybe you might like it. But be warned that this is supposed to be Japanese, but in the 8 minutes that I watched, it was just a bunch of white men with their eyebrows arched and they were supposed to be Japanese. So do with that what you will. Another sketchy coincidence is a murder that happened in June of 1963. Robert Domingos and his fiancée Linda Edwards were seniors at Lompoc High School. Well, it was senior ditch day and they wanted to go hang out at the state park. It was called Gaviota State Park. They were just gonna hang out on the coast, lay out on the beach, get a tan, maybe jump in the water, but they never returned home. Robert's worried father knew where they were supposed to be, so he hopped into his car and headed out to the park, where he found both of their bodies bound with rope inside of a crumbling shack. Robert had been shot 11 times and Linda had been shot 9 times. This was never a confirmed Zodiac attack, but there were many similarities. A young couple near water shot with the same type of ammunition that was used at the Lake Herman Road shooting. During this exact time, early June of 1963, Arthur Lee Allen approached Phyllis Seawater and asked her if he could take the kids on a trip with him up the coast while he did some diving. She agreed, and so off they went. The Seawaters remember Mr. Allen stopping at a military store where he bought a box of what they now know to be ammunition and a pack of beer. According to Connie and David Seawater, they went to Gaviota State Park. Mr. Allen pulled right up alongside the coast and he went off, ordering them to stay in the car until he got back. Of course, as soon as he was out of sight, they hopped out of the car and they were just playing, being kids basically. He ended up being gone about an hour or 45 minutes, but when he just reappeared out of nowhere, he was dripping blood from his hands. Connie, being scared that he hurt himself, jumped up, grabbed a rag, and went to help him. And both Connie and David said that he just threw her to the ground. Mr. Allen then put whatever he had in his hands, he threw it into the trunk, and he ordered all the kids to get into the car, and they just like peeled out. This was a place they had been many times before, and they never knew that a murder happened there when they were there. And if that wasn't strange enough, when they got back home, Arthur Lee Allen packed up all of his stuff, packed up his trailer, and he moved out of town. After that, the visits with Mr. Allen became a lot less frequent. They didn't see him that much. And then one day in 1966, Mr. Allen calls up and tells Phyllis to put Connie on the phone. When Connie gets on the phone, she said that Mr. Allen told her that he was coming to pick her up for a weekend trip, just the two of them. Connie was 15. Her brother David was 16, and he was like, Connie's not going anywhere alone with you. So he volunteered himself to also go with them for that weekend. Not Phyllis. Her son David said you're not going to be alone with her. So they all headed up the coast to a race car event. This was October 30th, 1966 in Riverside, California. They had gotten to Riverside pretty early, so they had done all the things by like 5 p.m. So Arthur Lee Allen gets them a hotel room. The children remember eating and then literally blacking out. Connie's brother passed out before she did, and she remembers trying to wake him up and thinking like, wow, he is sleeping like incredibly hard. She said that he was impossible to wake up. The next thing they knew, it was morning and Mr. Allen was leading them to the car. They were still groggy and drowsy. They could barely walk, but he wanted to leave Riverside in a hurry. This was the same day and the same location that Sherry Jo Bates was killed. Robert Graysmith was an investigative reporter and an author who started working with the police on the Zodiac case. The department would actually share information with him and he would share information with the department back and forth. It sounds kind of sketchy for an open investigation, but desperation. Well, Robert had been researching the psychology of serial killers, and one thing he learned was that often these killers would insert themselves into investigations or offer to be some type of help. So Robert asked one of the detectives on the case if there was anyone he could think of who had offered to help. The detective opens his drawer and says only 1 out of 2,500 names has ever offered to help. The detective then pulls out a card from Arthur Lee Allen that says, "Sorry I couldn't help you catch your killer." Not long after that was when Don Chaney came to the police and reported Arthur Lee Allen. The two lead detectives on this case, Detective Armstrong and Detective Toshi, went to go visit Arthur Lee Allen at work. By this time, he was working as a chemist near Vallejo, and so they just popped up on him at work, and he was pissed. He was not happy. Besides his anger, the detective started noticing some other things about Arthur. First, he fit the Zodiac description to a T, both in his face and in his build. He was obviously intelligent. He was a teacher turned chemist. The shoes he had on were the exact same shoes that one of the survivors had described, these military combat boots. One thing that really solidified Arthur Lee Allen as a suspect was when they glanced down at his wrist, and he was wearing a Zodiac brand diving watch that apparently he got from his mother. The police got a search warrant to search his trailer, and they found lots of frozen birds and squirrels, really weird things in his freezer, but nothing weird enough to arrest him. Police didn't find any real evidence to link Arthur Lee Allen to the Zodiac crimes, but there was tons of circumstantial evidence. Like the fact that when Arthur Lee Allen was serving a 4-year sentence, I can't remember if it was a prison sentence or he was actually being institutionalized, but he was away serving a 4-year sentence, and during that entire time, the Zodiac disappeared. As soon as Arthur Lee Allen was released, all of a sudden the Zodiac reappeared. Very suspicious, but not proof. The case went cold, and it seemed as if people had given up or forgotten about the Zodiac. That was until 1991, when police received a tip from an informant that the Zodiac was Arthur Lee Allen. The informant knew this because he knew Arthur Lee Allen, and Arthur had talked to him about his plans to drive to San Francisco and to shoot a cab driver. This gave police cause to get another search warrant, and this time they found like 4 bombs, a detonation cord, and like 7 torpedoes. He also had a box full of clippings from the case, a typewriter just like one the Zodiac had used, and he had instructions on how to make a bomb that looked very similar to what the Zodiac had sent into police. The police took Arthur Lee Allen in for an official interview, but in the end, he was never charged in connection with any of the Zodiac crimes. But to the public, he was the Zodiac. He was hounded and harassed on the streets, but Arthur Lee Allen said that he had nothing to do with the Zodiac crimes. He also said that the bombs that the police found were from an old friend of his that he let store some things in his basement, and he never asked what they were. He had actually forgotten that anything was even down there, and he was just as surprised as everyone else when the police found bombs and torpedoes. In 1992, David Seawater got in touch with Arthur Lee Allen. Basically, his mom told him that Arthur was on dialysis 3 times a week.
Nobody gives a damn.
Wasn't doing well. He wanted to talk to David and that he should call him. You know how parents can be. It wasn't a request. She was telling him to call, so he called. Anyway, David is thanking him for being so kind and good to them as children, when all of a sudden Arthur just burst out into tears, crying, and through his mumbles he says, "I wasn't as good to you as you think I was. I drugged you." Then Arthur admitted to having inappropriate contact with Connie while she was under the influence of whatever he slipped her. Arthur is sobbing so hard that he cannot even catch his breath, and David asks him, "Mr. Allen, are you the Zodiac?" According to David, Arthur Lee Allen got very quiet, and then in this pathetic little voice, he said, "Yes, it was me." David did contact the police, but he was told that there's nothing that they could do about it before they hung up in his face. August 26, 1992, Arthur Lee Allen passed away at the age of 58 from heart disease. When his body was found, crazy enough, he had been writing a letter. He had it gripped in his hand. It was to the police, and it was denying that he was the Zodiac Killer. In March of 2007, a movie was released based off of the investigative reporter Robert Graysmith's book. It was just a collection of every single thing he had on the Zodiac. Remember, he worked side by side with the police, so this was a juicy book and a juicier movie. This movie solidified in the minds of the Seawater children that Arthur Lee Allen was probably the Zodiac. As they were watching the movie, they realized that they had been to every single crime scene before it was a crime scene. One of the moments in the movie that really stood out for the Seawaters as well was the Zodiac's hood. When they saw the hood in the movie, they recognized this as one of the hoods that they would make with Mr. Allen for his diving. So they actually crafted these square type hoods with him. In 2017, another one of the Zodiac's many letters was finally decoded. This letter basically said that the Zodiac was alive and well, and it gave the name of his next victim. The victim's name was Connie Henley. Now, oddly enough, Phyllis, Connie's mother, her maiden name was Hensley. So Connie's name could have been Connie Hensley, but the Zodiac was known for misspelling things intentionally, so maybe he put Connie Henley. It was weird, just another one of these rabbit holes that the Zodiac sent people down, but Connie lived. This letter was sent in 1973, and in 1973, Connie remembers Mr. Allen calling her like, hey, I'm gonna come pick you up for another fun weekend, kind of like out of the blue. But she was married and she had 2 children, and she basically told him like, I can't go off with you. Arthur was so upset because he didn't even like her husband, so he was pretty pissed. And after that, weirdly enough, Connie kept getting these strange phone calls with just like breathing on the other end, heavy, creepy breathing, but she did not think that that was Mr. Allen. In 2020, there was another group of amateur code crackers, and they actually developed a program specifically designed to cracking the second cipher. It took the program months of working around the clock, spitting out about 650,000 possible versions of the cipher. At first, it was just a bunch of jumbled mess, but eventually the program ended up spitting out a possible translation that sounded a lot like the Zodiac. But surprisingly, maybe to someone, but not to me, this was just another letter about the Zodiac bragging on how the police could not catch him or break his ciphers. He talked about how much he enjoyed being a killer, yada yada. And again, even though he promised, he did not reveal his name. There are still 2 unsolved ciphers from the Zodiac, so possibly his name could be in those. I highly doubt it, but you let me know what you think. And almost just as an important of a question, if they had so much evidence against him, even though it was circumstantial, why was he never arrested? Why was he never charged? Circumstantial cases are a thing. I don't know about you, but I've seen a lot of people convicted on a whole lot less. In my opinion, he looks pretty guilty, but I'm also inclined to believe that there must have been a lot of doubt if he was never arrested or charged. Because I know they wanted to. Police just never found that smoking gun that they were looking for. If you've made it this far, please remember to hit that subscribe button before you leave, and I will see you down another rabbit hole.